Have you heard of the British government Kincora abuse scandal in Northern Ireland? How the British intelligence and police used the Kincora boys' home and other homes and places as a honey trap to blackmail and compromise the abusers. Hi, I'm Father Sean McManus, President of the Capitol Hill-based Irish National Caucus in Washington, D.C., and the Chief Judge of the World Peace Prize. And this is our 26th social media video relating to England's partition of Ireland 100 years ago. The role of the British government in the horrible systematic sexual abuse in the Kincora boys' home and other homes is one of the worst scandals of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But in this case, the British government was not oppressing Catholics, the usual victims, but Protestants. Now, we all know too well the horrible evil that happens when church or state is complicit in child sexual abuse and cover-up. And the Kincora scandal is a particularly evil example and is not sufficiently well known. The abuses happened in the 1970s, and Kincora home was closed in 1980. In that sense, it's an old story, but the suffering of the victims endures as fresh as ever. What is new about this story is that the Irish National Caucus has launched a campaign to raise the issue in the United States Congress. Kincora Home was a home for Protestant boys run by Protestants, some of whom were pedophiles and who turned the home into a sort of male brothel where other pedophiles could come and sexually abuse the poor, defenseless boys, and not always inside the walls of Kincora. What made it worse was that the home was used by people of power, politicians, and the well-connected. And making it even 1,000 times more serious was this: British intelligence knew all about it because some of those in charge of the home were not only pedophiles, but also British agents. And the British government turned Kincora and other places into an intelligence blackmail honey trap. One of the best known victims of this British government abuse is Richard Kerr, now 60 and now a citizen of the United States. Richard was put in touch with the Irish National Caucus by Belfast man Donal Lavery, a writer and commentator, who asked if we could raise the Richard Kerr case as we raised the case of the other Belfast Protestant, Belfast man Raymond McCord Jr., who was beaten to death in 1997 near Belfast by Protestant paramilitaries. Because some of those involved in the murder were British agents and police informers, the British government covered up the crime and still to this day covers up the crime. But Richard Kerr's story is not just confined to Kincora, which was a home for 16 to 18-year-old boys. Indeed, Richard was sexually abused starting at 8 years old in Williamson House, Belfast, and continuing in 6 institutional homes while under state care until he was 18 years old. The British government wants to therefore confine the abuse case to Kincora, for which 3 lower level abusers went to prison. Yet powerful people who abused Richard outside the walls of Kincora walked away free. Kincora and its confines are only the tip of the iceberg. Now, Richard has a High Court case coming up in the fall in Northern Ireland, but nothing done in Congress will infringe on that case. None of our lobbying in the US Congress over 50 years has ever infringed on any case in Northern Ireland. In fact, it has only helped those cases. In 50 years, Raymond McCord Sr. and Richard Kerr are the only 2 Protestant activist victims from Northern Ireland who have sought our help to raise their issue in the US Congress. And that is because Protestants, Unionists, Loyalists dare not break rank and challenge British intelligence and the British government, because when they do, they are isolated and shunned by the Protestant establishment and power structure in Northern Ireland. And this is even more reason, apart from the intrinsic merit of their case, why they should be supported by the Irish National Caucus and our congressional friends. I deeply believe that ecumenism is at its best when Protestants and Catholics from Northern Ireland not only pray together for peace, but also work together for justice, because peace, as Blessed Martin Luther King Jr. and St. Pope John Paul II taught us, peace is the fruit of justice and solidarity. Now, about our actual campaign to raise the Richard Kerr case in the United States Congress. We have, of course, not only contacted the many congressional friends of the Irish National Caucus in Congress, who are very involved in standing up for equality, solidarity, justice and peace in all of Ireland, but we have also reached out to the Human Trafficking Caucus in the Congress, because Richard Kerr was trafficked by very powerful people from Belfast to Sligo in the Irish Republic, from Belfast to London, to Rome, to Vienna, and finally to America. And the wonderful thing about the Human Trafficking Caucus in the Congress is that it was co-founded by 2 members of Congress with a long and totally excellent record on human rights in Northern Ireland. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, a New York Democrat, chairwoman of the House Oversight Committee, and by Congressman Chris Smith, a Republican from New Jersey, who, when Republicans controlled the House of Representatives over the years, held a total of 18 congressional hearings on Northern Ireland. So we look forward to many members of Congress rallying to the just cause of Richard Kerr. He has been treated horribly by the British government, and now it's time for America to stand up for this American citizen. Thank you for watching. God bless America, and God save Ireland.
In May of 2021, a virtual conference was held by a group of people who have been campaigning to obtain justice for the victims of the Anglo-Irish paedophile vice ring. The speakers included the author Andrew Lowney, who spoke about the development of the ring and its connections to Sir Anthony Blunt of MI5 and Buckingham Palace, Lord Louis Mountbatten and others. Colin Wallace, a former psychological operations officer with the British Army, spoke next. He had learnt about the ring long before it became public knowledge and had tried to expose it at great personal expense. Donal Lavery also contributed. He is writing a book about Dr. Maurice Fraser, a key member of the ring. He also addressed the gruesome murder of Brian McDermott in 1973. The final contribution was that of John McMahon, a victim of the ring. Barbara Flaherty and Father Sean McManus of the Irish National Caucus were invited to attend as guests on account of their interest in the scandal. The discussion was chaired by David Burke, a lawyer based in Dublin. Andrew, you've written two books which touch upon Ireland. You've written a biography of Guy Burgess, and more recently you've published a very successful book about the life of Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife. Insofar as the Anglo-Irish vice ring is concerned, what have you discovered?
Well, it was a vice ring that operated in many of the country houses. There were men of a certain generation. One of the leading characters was the spy Anthony Blunt, and a close friend of his called Peter Montgomery, who had met at Cambridge. And this was a group of gay men who would hold parties at these country houses. And there would be boys that would be brought, or young men would be brought there, invited. Some had been trafficked. It's very clear that they, in a sense, had a life in Ireland that they felt they could lead that they didn't have in Britain. Guy Burgess was on the periphery of this, and so was, of course, Mountbatten. Though I think from my research, Mountbatten tended to just traffic the boys to his country home, Classieborne, rather than go quite so much to these parties. But you and I have been to some of these houses. We've attempted and actually seen some of the guest books, and indeed talked to people who were working there at the time. And it's very interesting to see the range of people there at these particular parties. Well, one of the extraordinary things was that I discovered not only was he bisexual, but that he had a liking for young teenage boys. And two of them, 16 and 1977, spoke to me about their experiences at Classieborne. I checked them out. Everything they said held together. The descriptions of Classieborne and some of the members of staff there rang true. And I felt they were very credible characters, and their stories tied in together. One was abused at Classieborne, one was abused at a hotel outside. When I approached the Garda to ask the car logs for August 1977 when they were abused, the Garda admitted that they held those car logs, but they refused to divulge them, saying they were involved in the murder inquiry. Well, since the murder of Mountbatten took place 2 years later, it's odd to see how those could be relevant. An FBI file was opened on Mountbatten during the war when he was made Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. And this really happened by chance. They were interviewing a woman about something else, and she happened to mention that he had a perverted taste for young men. And subsequently, other people were interviewed who confirmed that, including an intelligence officer called John Gombrich, a former wife of a viceroy of India. And so these are reputable witnesses saying very much the same things. And the files on him and indeed on his wife Edwina carried on through to the 1950s. And of course, this was of interest to the FBI because he eventually became First Sea Lord and Chief of Defense Staff. So he had defense secrets and clearly was opening himself up to blackmail through his activities. But in the course of researching the book, I came across numerous people who had been seduced by him, or he attempted to seduce, or had heard stories about him, and including, for example, one of his drivers who'd been asked to take him to a brothel, male brothel. So there's an accumulation of evidence, both from official papers and from interviews, that backs up the fact that not only was he bisexual, but a paedophile.
Do you find that that is compatible with what these two boys, who one of whom was from Kincora and one of whom was linked to the Anglo-Irish vice ring, people who ran Kincora and brought Mountbatten up, do you find what they say credible?
Yes, it rings true. I mean, for example, he had a preference for oral sex, which is one of the things that comes across in some of the other accounts. He seemed very ashamed in some ways and diffident. And there's also an account from the war from a man called Norman Neild, who was a driver who went to live in New Zealand. And the account that he gives, and he brought young children to Mountbatten in about 1942, again rings true with what the boys at Classieborn in 77 said, and the accounts from other people.
You mentioned Anthony Blunt earlier on. He was the keeper of the Queen's pictures, and he was very much involved in social activities in Ireland. And of course, he was later on revealed to be a Soviet spy within MI5. And he was interrogated for 7 years by MI5. Well, what is it you believe MI5, through Peter Wright and his colleagues who were talking to Blunt, knew by the end of the 60s about the Anglo-Irish vice ring?
Well, I think they could see the connections with the Kinkora boys' home in Belfast and some of the figures who worked there and abused the boys. There were also references to a well-known private school, Portora, which was close to Peter Montgomery's home. So there seems to have been a link between MI5, the Anglo-Irish vice ring, these figures from the Cambridge spy ring, and Kinkora, and some of these big country houses. So there do seem to be all sorts of associations, which seems slightly unusual.
Colin, what did you learn? When did you first learn about this horrific circle?
I stumbled on Kinkora really by accident. My role was in psychological operations. So what I was trying to do was disrupt terrorist organizations. To do that, I needed to understand the personalities. I really needed to know if there are any particular rivalries or conflicts and so on and so forth. But in 1971, I stumbled on an organization called the Orange Discussion Group. And it was meeting at an Orange Hall in Belfast. And one of the things I noticed was that some of the people attending the meeting had been involved in the bombing campaign to remove the previous Northern Ireland Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill. And so, in fact, members of this Orange Discussion Group were really members of the UVF. Of course, bearing in mind that they were responsible for bombing from a military point of view, that was particularly interesting to the Army. The Army had no role in investigating child sex abuse. That's the key thing. It was a police matter. But one of the other things we discovered was that attending those meetings were members of the RUC. So there was clearly a matter of concern just in that group. The more we looked at it, the more interesting it became, because the leader of the group was a man called William McGrath. And William McGrath appeared from nowhere. He'd been part of the same campaign to oust Terence O'Neill as Prime Minister. So he was a creature of the political right. But he was also an Elmer Gantry type person. He was a self-styled evangelical preacher. What we now know, of course, this was all a front because it was part of his plan to get access to young boys. For some time, nothing seemed to happen in that this organization now called TARA, which was paramilitary, rumbled along at its own pace. But then in 1973, we got the first allegations of abuse taking place at the home. We also discovered that some members of Tara trained at Peter Montgomery's estate in County Tyrone. So we had the first connection, a surprising connection, between a paramilitary organization and Peter Montgomery. And it's also important just to go back to what Andrew said. You see, we had followed Peter Montgomery very closely. By the way, he was a cousin of Field Marshal Montgomery from World War II. So again, in terms of Irish folklore and key people, he was right up at the top end of the league. But the interesting thing is, although we knew a lot about Peter Montgomery, I was never aware of the connection with Blunt. And that fits in on what Andrew was saying with MI5, that it's almost as though any reference to Blunt was removed from the material that I was getting at that stage. Mm. And then, of course, in 1973, there were quite a few allegations of abuse that didn't really take off and attract a lot of attention until McGrath issued a proclamation round about Easter 1973. And there were two key statements in the proclamation. One was that the Roman Catholic Church should be made illegal. And the second one was that all religious instruction in schools, including Roman Catholic schools, should be carried out by evangelical Protestants. Now, you know, in Northern Ireland, that was quite something. But what was terrific for us, we suddenly got a harvest of information from Protestant clergy who were incensed at what he was doing. And what they told us was really interesting. They told us that this Irish mission, McGrath had been abusing children there for years. McGrath offered counselling to parents for their children. And actually, very senior clergy actually recommended to parents to send their children to McGrath. It was horrific when you look back on it. So then when he got them into this large house, part of his therapy was sexual abuse. The army began to look at what he was doing. Part of the difficulty we had was that although most of the time we had a good relationship with the RUC, there were very strong sensitivities. And because we knew that McGrath was a key loyalist with a following in the RUC, and particularly at high level, we had to be seen not to be interfering in what was a police matter. So my superiors then briefed me to tell the press about this strange organization called Tara. And I had a written brief which said that McGrath was a homosexual and that he worked in a children's home. And then I mentioned some political figures as well, who at that stage we suspected were homosexual as well. So there was a little sort of group. The trouble was that I think it was probably not obvious enough, because although a couple of reporters did report on it, and the stories weren't published, the difficulty was that they didn't get behind that into what this paedophile role was. I gave that to the press, and then a senior MI5 officer in the headquarters with me reported me to MI5 in London for briefing the press. So on one side, the army is saying, tell the press what this man's up to. On the other hand, MI5 were shutting it down. What I didn't realize was, because I was moved out of Northern Ireland then, another army intelligence officer came in just as I was leaving. He wrote a report about McGrath. He discovered McGrath completely separately from me, different sources. He wrote a report, he talked about the abuse at Kincora, and he took it to the same MI5 officer who told him to stop investigating it.
That's Brian Gemmell, I think, isn't it?
That's Brian Gemmell.
And yeah. Ian Cameron is the very senior MI5 officer to whom both of you were reporting it.
Absolutely. See, if I jump forward to the Terry inquiry, which is a police investigation that was caused by the arrest of McGrath eventually in 1980. When the government brought in the police to investigate, what was going on, they discovered that Ian Cameron had blocked an investigation of McGrath, and this was really, very, very important evidence. But they didn't tell Parliament, so Parliament didn't know about Brian Gemmell's report, and that was suppressed by MI5. So what the British Parliament did was think, well, there's nothing really to this. We don't need to pursue the matter any further. So instead of having a full judicial inquiry with the power to subpoena witnesses, they just let it drift into an administrative investigation into the way the homes were run. So in fact, this got really MI5 and of course the people around McGrath off the hook.
So there's long been suspicion that the British secret state, particularly MI5, knew about Kincora and exploited it for various nefarious reasons. One of which was an operation called Operation Clockwork Orange. Can you tell us about Clockwork Orange?
And so Clockwork Orange is really an umbrella title for different psychological operations. The key thing about it was that in the years that followed, first of all, the government and the Minister of Defence denied totally that Clockwork Orange existed. And then fortunately, I had my handwritten notes, which includes reference to McGrath and McCaig and to a man called Van Strabenzie, who was a government minister at Stormont. And clearly they didn't realize I had those notes. The thing emerged the next year when a document surfaced with the Northern Ireland office accusing key members of the DUP of being homosexuals or child abusers. And they actually named a number of people. And that document was followed about a couple of months later by a very similar one, but this time naming different individuals. And in 1976, I was then living in London. The Reverend Paisley came to see me and he told me about the documents and he asked me if I knew anything about them because he'd obviously been made aware of what my role was in Northern Ireland. And of course, it happened after my time. But it was really important that that was coming from government sources and it was designed to manipulate the politics of Northern Ireland.
Is it fair of me to characterize what you're saying as follows? Cameron and others in the intelligence community knew what was going on. They
Correct.
collected information. They had suppressed police inquiries. They had suppressed efforts by the military, some of the very honourable people in the British military, to get this into the press, and that they were holding it back to either embarrass or blackmail loyalist politicians.
Yes, I think that's very obvious because on one hand, you have the military pushing the information out in the hope the press will expose the story, which eventually led to the prosecution. But on the other hand, you have MI5 stopping it being sent out. And when it was sent out, I was then accused of breaching security, even though my bosses were actually saying, get the press to have a look at this. So
you continue to try and attempt to do your best for the boys in Kinkora. You tried to press to get the media to be interested, and that a whole slew of dirty tricks ensued, one of which was to remove you from your post for the ridiculous accusation which amounted to for basically doing your job. But during your appeals against your unfair dismissal, there were letters and documents which you sent at least 5 years before the Kinkora scandal erupted, referring specifically to hotels where boys were being abused. And now with the passage of time, some of the boys who were abused there, like Richard Kerr, have come forward and confirmed that. And if you could just briefly tell me a little bit about the Terry inquiry and the Hughes inquiry and why you feel they failed.
Well, I think the hotels piece is very important because in 1975, I wrote to my former boss, who then retired, and I listed 3 hotels, 2 in East Belfast and 1 in Bangor, where boys were being abused. These were hotels where there were discotheques. And in the 70s, that allowed young people to come and go without being accompanied by an adult and looking out of place. So it was a perfect cover. And the army in 1974 discovered this, but they also were extremely worried because 2 of the hotels in East Belfast were used by the leadership of the UDA for meetings. And indeed, one Catholic teenager who was working part-time was actually shot and killed by the UDA. When the Terry inquiry was set up after the Kincora saga was exposed in the press, Jim Pryor, the Secretary for Northern Ireland, promised Parliament he would get an independent chief constable to investigate allegations the RUC didn't act fast enough. In fact, he appointed Sir George Terry from Sussex, and we now know that Sir George Terry was requested by the Chief Constable of the RUC. When his report was written, he made no mention that Brian Gemmell had written a report about abuse at Kincora, and he made no mention that Ian Cameron of MI5 had actually stopped Brian Gemmell from investigating Kincora. So at that point, if Parliament had known that, there would have been a public inquiry. There is no doubt of that. So what they then did was they set up...
It might sound like a silly question, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless. Why do you think a chief constable of Sussex would come to Northern Ireland, discover all of this, and conceal it in a report?
Well, it doesn't make sense. In 1980, I was convicted of manslaughter, and the chief constable in charge of the case was from Sussex. It was George Terry.
Same man.
And the police officer who actually was responsible for my wrongful conviction was the officer appointed by Terry to investigate Kincora. Now, you could say that's a coincidence. The person who died, the first post-mortem, the police said foul play was not suspected. And then they asked for a second post-mortem. And this time the pathologist found an injury he hadn't seen the first time. Home office pathologist. And there was a small bruise to the base of the nose. And what the police said was this was a specialist military blow that hit the nose and then fractured the skull. So that evidence wasn't challenged. But years later, Professor Bernard Knight, key pathologist over here, he read this and said it was rubbish. And so when we got to the appeal court, 5 key neurosurgeons and brain specialists all said it was rubbish. And the Home Office pathologist then admitted he'd never seen an injury like that. And worse still, he admitted he got it from an American Secret Service. But why is a British pathologist talking to the American Secret Service about my case? That was total, just absolutely impossible to understand. But the conviction was quashed and the sentence was quashed, so that was it. My case arose 4 months after Kincora.
John McCaig, he was involved with the Kincora ring. He had made threats that if he was going to be prosecuted, he was going to tell all.
Oh, I think he was working for the intelligence world long before that. He wasn't, I think he was working for the army, but that's personal view. McCaig was important because he was involved in the bombing campaign against Terence O'Neill as well. So at that stage, he, McGrath, and this group have a lot in common. Part of the issue with McCaig was that he belonged to Ian Paisley's Ulster Constitution Defence Committee. So when I stumbled on Tara, or the Orange Discussion Group as it was in 1971, a number of key people in Tara all worked for the Paisley organisation. They ran his newspaper. And clearly there was a political connection between McGrath and the Paisley organisation. But in the bombing campaign against O'Neill, McCaig's partner was a man called Alan Campbell. And Alan Campbell was like McGrath. He was an evangelical preacher, but he was also a paedophile. And in 1972, he sexually abused a boy from Bonmore Home. And he abused that boy at a flat in Belfast owned by an individual called Ken Larmour. Ken Larmour was a former social worker who, believe it or not, became clerk to Belfast Magistrates Court. And so Campbell and Larmour were very close. But the interesting thing is, when the boy complained about the abuse at the flat, the police arrested Campbell, but they made no connection between Campbell and Larmour. So there was quite an important group or ring link here, which the police, for one reason or another, just didn't follow up. And then when Campbell's case went to court, it was dismissed. And after the case was dismissed, the file on the case disappeared, has never been seen since, because Larmour was clerk to the court where Campbell was appearing. And these were really big clues that any constable, let alone a detective, would have picked up, and they were never pursued. But when it became important was a young boy called Brian McDermott was murdered in East Belfast, and it was a really gruesome murder. The police initially suspected that Campbell was responsible, and in fact they were telling the press that an arrest was imminent. And they also said there was a possibility of witchcraft involved in the way the body was dismembered and burned. And then suddenly the police dropped their interest in Campbell, and literally that was it. And to this
would
day,
have the power to stop a police investigation.
that is the key thing. That was the key thing. And when you got really a lot of enthusiasm by the police that they felt they got the right person, then literally that was it. It just stopped dead. And to this day, no one has been made to account for that murder. Second inquiry under Judge Hughes, who I thought was a great man. He was, his inquiry was set up, instead of having a full judicial inquiry, it was to look at homes. But what Parliament didn't realise was, although he promised that Judge Hughes could investigate anything relating to abuse at the homes, when he got his terms of reference, it deliberately excluded, in writing, any investigation of the Army and the RUC and British and Intelligence Service. The Hart inquiry was a farce. I wrote and offered to take part in the inquiry. Then Judge Hart said that he felt his inquiry didn't have sufficient powers to investigate MI5. And at that point, my solicitor told me to disengage because the same thing was going to happen. But we have lots of key witnesses who had superb information on Kinkora who were never called.
It was abuse. It was going on for decades. There were these evil people preying upon children in care, wantonly abusing them. This was known to large numbers of people, even long before the Troubles started. That Peter Wright of MI5 investigated the background to Blunt and all of his activities in Ireland thoroughly. Nothing happened. No one was ever prosecuted. After the Troubles began, despite the honourable behaviour of General Lang and some of the others, and including yourself and Brian Gamble, the thing was still managed to be covered up. The RUC did absolutely nothing. Ian Cameron of MI5 and his colleagues suppressed, prevented further inquiries. Compromat was collected on loyalist politicians, and some of which was used in the manner you described in that memorandum that was put about. People like John McCaig were agents. People like Alan Campbell were suspected of murder and got away with it. And lo and behold, the only person involved in any way in the events surrounding Kinkora, whoever went to prison was yourself, and you were framed, and there was fraudulent perjured evidence, and you spent 5 or 6 years behind bars, and nobody else has ever been punished from this, aside from the 3 individuals who were caught so red-handed that there was no possibility of covering them up. Those were the staff at Kincora. And there have been multiple inquiries into Kincora. Aside from the ones you've mentioned, there were other ones, local authority ones. And the official position of the British state as it stands today in 2021 is that there's nothing to see here. All Kincora was some misbehavior in an isolated fashion by some staff members who were punished, and it didn't go any wider than that. Is that a fair characterization?
It's even more significant than that, because in 1990, the government brought in Sir David Calcutt QC, leading lawyer, to investigate what happened to me. And then Tom King, the Defence Secretary, wrote to Margaret Thatcher, and I have a copy of the letter, and he said that Mr. Calcutt can do X, Y, and Z, but he must be kept away from investigating Kincora and Clockwork Orange.
Why would that have been a stipulation?
It's as blatant as that.
In terms of Maurice Fraser, this doctor involved in abuse, but they had been convicted of it numerous times, including in the US and in England. And they had never been struck off as a doctor, despite the abuse occurring in the 1970s, known abuse. They were allowed to continue to practice medicine until the 1990s. And one of the most pertinent things in that is that the future Attorney General and Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Sir Patrick Mayhew, actually accompanied Fraser to one of the meetings of his fitness to practice investigation by the General Medical Council. Now, they blamed that on a group of drunken homosexual children. That was more or less the terminology they used, and that basically these children were trying to destroy this good man's reputation and so forth, and that he wouldn't be involved in this sort of activity but for minors. You know, that was sort of their...
what years are we talking about, Don?
We're talking in the 70s.
70s, okay.
We're talking in the 70s. He had been convicted a number of times in the 70s, but...
73.
Yes, that's correct, yeah. And then it happened in New York as well. On top of that, he was convicted for abusing 15 boys in New York. He was part of a group, a ring of paedophiles that were convicted in New York. There was a respectability to him on a superficial level, because here you have, you know, a medical doctor educated at Queen's University. He had featured in NBC News documentaries, particularly regarding the impact of the conflict on children. He had appeared in BBC Songs of Praise. He had been a guest speaker at the NSPCC events regarding just basically emotional and psychological issues concerning the welfare of children. And this was all when the police and the state were quite aware of what he had been involved in. And from the 70s, there was a concentrated campaign by his police handlers and the security services to ensure that Dr. Fraser, it would never be made public the extent of his criminality. Now, it was in America because there were no British reporting restrictions there. Here was an enormous scandal which had merited a BBC Spotlight documentary and various other coverage over the years, but no one had actually written a book specifically into Fraser's role. And I was a friend of Lyra McKee. The last time I spoke to her before she died, we had both said that we actually felt quite afraid of some of the things that we were coming across. And I mean, we weren't the only people to put freedom of information requests in, which were rejected on grounds of national security. I understand that Dr. Niall Meehan, I think as well, he tried to get information from the Ministry of Defence relating to Maurice Fraser, and they knocked it back on grounds of national security. So it does beg the question, what does a psychiatrist, a consultant psychiatrist, sitting in the Royal Hospital in Belfast for sick children, what relationship do they have with British military intelligence or the Ministry of Defence? And it wasn't until I had spoken to a number of victims and survivors of Dr. Fraser that their terminology was that Fraser was someone who was brought in, and Colin will confirm that he was seen on some occasions in Ministry of Defence property. Fraser was brought in to ascertain which children were capable of this psychological conditioning in terms of who could be selected as a child to become what one victim termed a boy soldier, whereby they would be sent out to these hotels and various facilities, trafficked from Kincora to different locations to engage in sexual activity, abuse, with prominent people that would then be used to compromise them, because the rooms would be bugged, or they would be photographed and so forth, leaving the buildings. The Europa Hotel was one that had been mentioned to me quite a lot where this went on. The victim in question, they spoke to me on the basis that I had been a friend of Lyra and was sort of picking up where she left off. And they appeared isolated in the US in that, because they were of a Protestant Unionist loyalist background in terms of their origin in Belfast, they didn't have the support which, say, someone from the Catholic Nationalist Republican community, so to speak, would have. And that's where I put them in touch with Father McManus, because him and Barbara in the Irish National Caucus have helped Protestants before who have been the victims of human rights violations, like Raymond McCord, whose son was collusion in terms of his son's murder. And not one unionist politician would ever address that with Raymond McCord, I have to say that. But in terms of Dr. Fraser himself, one of the things that I found extremely striking was that part of the Hart inquiry, which, is not ancient history, we're only talking a few years ago, he was never summoned or subject to an EU extradition warrant, despite the fact that Fraser now lives in Holland. He never gave testimony or evidence to it, even though they were looking into his crimes over the years. And it seems a bit bizarre, if I'm honest, that Judge Hart could reach the conclusion he did, that the abuse was solely confined to the staff at Kinkora, without even so much as speaking to people like Fraser. It seemed like a regurgitation of all the previous failed and farcical inquiries that had gone before it. This issue of sexual deviancy is used to compromise these people, particularly in an era when morals were a lot more conservative and so forth than what they are now. And then what the state often finds is that once they've recruited them, it's like trying to keep a tiger by the tail with the likes of Alan Campbell, because, or indeed Dr. Fraser, but with Alan Campbell in particular, you had a man who not only was working for the state, and who people like David Irvine, the former loyalist politician, actually said Campbell's role was to stoke up tension at any sort of interface where he could. He was very much opposed to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, very much opposed to St Andrews. He broke with Ian Paisley on that issue, and Irvine had accused him of working to some shady, nefarious state agenda. The interesting thing about Campbell and Fraser is that both of them were subject to inspections or probes by their professional body. In Campbell's case, it was a Ministry of Education probe, and they were always allowed to keep their positions. Campbell he wasn't just an evangelical pastor, he was also a secondary school teacher at a prominent Belfast high school.
Donald, you're writing a book at the moment, isn't that right?
We're starting off with the murder of Brian McDermott. They've tried to mislead people who've been writing about that issue before, in the sense that they led them to believe that John McCaig was responsible for it, but McCaig was actually in prison when that happened. So it was really to deflect from the fact that Alan Campbell was he was a state agent, but he was this teacher, essentially was the man who had murdered not just that child, but Lyra McKay's subsequent work, The Lost Boys, which is still due to be published, goes into the disappearance off the face of the earth of two other children who they completely went missing. They were meant to be going to a school in North Belfast where Campbell lived, and he essentially was connected to that as well. And all of this, the interesting thing about McCaig was that he was killed on the day that he was due to go and give evidence at the Kinkora trial, having struck a plea bargain, you might say, to name names. He was working for the security services already. The staff who were being prosecuted changed their pleas the night before, in that Ian Paisley's right-hand man, the barrister Desmond Bowl, was ordered to go to the Crumlin Road jail the night before the trial and to basically accept instructions alongside the solicitor to change from a plea of not guilty to guilty, so that there would be no protracted trial and that all of this would not emerge. A lot of people speak about it or write about it as though William McGrath was the central sort of figure. I actually think he was a very peripheral figure, a dangerous man and a paedophile, I have no doubt about that, and a horrific abuser. But I noticed that Village magazine is one of the very few outlets which highlight the central importance of Joseph Mains. I mean, this was someone who had been a former B special. His brother was a very senior RUC man at the time in the police. He had a very close relationship with military intelligence.
One of the staggering things about the Hart inquiry was it received some information that it virtually ignored, that has been ignored by the mainstream media, particularly in Britain, completely, which revealed that according to MI6's own records, that Sir Maurice Oldfield, who was the security and intelligence coordinator in Northern Ireland, prior to that he had been the head of MI6, that he was, according to MI6, I'm quoting MI6 now,
yes,
he was a friend and had a relationship with the head of Kinkora Boys Home. Now, Mains was the head of Kinkora Boys Home, not McGrath, but it doesn't matter which of them this is a reference to. I believe it's a reference to Mains.
Yeah, and some of
that was completely ignored. Just to move on a little bit, I gather from our discussions earlier on, you have some new information that you'll be able to reveal in your book.
Yes, I mean, essentially we're looking at the figure of Alan Campbell a lot more, and also where do these people who are involved in child murder and child sexual abuse, let's examine the connection with this respected celebrity psychiatrist, you know, and that how do these people know each other? It's quite bizarre, other than for the fact that they were members of this vice ring.
And John McMahon, who's also with us, has some first-hand experience of Ken Lamore and the wider Kinkora circle, and perhaps John might be able to tell us a little bit about that.
I was pulled into this little cobweb. Let's put it this way, that Richard Kerr was in the center of the cobweb, living in an institutional home. And I was pulled into this story unbeknownst by Ken Larmer. My father was a solicitor in Ireland, an RD, and he had like 7 strokes, and we were in financial trouble and had to sell our home. Ken Larmer's friend from Belfast came down to buy our house and brought with him his legal expert, Ken Larmer. Ken Larmer saw me a mile away, not having a real father around, and convinced my mother that I was a kid who could be at risk and that he would mentor me and take over me. Ken Larmer's background was that he was a social worker calling on these institutional homes. And so in July of 1968, I met him in RD, and 10 days later, I was brought up to Belfast to stay with him for a long weekend. And the first night I was there, I was asleep at 10, and he slipped into my bed and sodomized me. At the age of 13, I was 13, and he had this foster parent mentoring role with me for 3 years. And this was his pattern. And he had been a social worker at that period of time, and then he went into the court system. I do remember from my first and second visit in July of 68, him talking about his friends. He liked to talk and impress me with the people he knew. A friend of his was William McGrath at Tara Lodge. And at the time, before Ken got his apartment, which was right in the Mount Vernon estate, right close to where the homes we're talking about were, like Williamson House and Kincora, Ken had been part of Tara Lodge and the Young Unionists. He then moved into the court system. Along the way, it doesn't make sense to the outside. As I say, it's because my father was in hospital. He died at 70 pounds when I was 17. But Ken sort of abused me, sexually abused me, but he was like a father to me. So it became very, very confusing, almost like, incest in a way. But along the line, I met many of his friends in Belfast. He brought me up to Belfast to get my glasses and things like that. I went to school in Ireland. Some of his friends that I recall now, one of them was this guy, Alan Campbell, whom I met in Ken's flat at Shore Road in North Belfast in the Mount Vernon estate. And Alan came maybe twice, as I recall, surrounded by a bunch of teenagers. He didn't seem old at the time, but he was older than me. I was maybe 14 or 15. By the time I was 16, 17, I was strong enough to be able to break away from him.
Was Ken Lamore involved in failed prosecution against, in any way, as a civil servant or a registrar or something like that, of Alan Campbell?
Absolutely. And
yet you knew he socialized with them and you saw them together?
Yeah. Well,
they were friends.
Yeah, so they were friends. It was clear they were friends because they spent a couple of hours together at Ken's place.
And the Alan Campbell file went missing or something, did it?
Okay, so my relationship with Ken was 1968 to 71, 72. In November of 1970, I discovered after the fact, because I got my hands on 80 pages of the Kasky report, Alan Campbell was charged with having sex with one of the young kids from Bournemore at Ken Larmer's own flat. Ken Larmer was not there at the time. He was in hospital, supposedly, and had given the keys to his flat to his friend Alan Campbell to keep an eye on it while he was in hospital. That was the official story that Ken Larmer gave. He was questioned by the police. He was also under the watchful eye of the police because they suspected he had a much larger role in perverting justice with the Alan Campbell case, because he is referenced in the Kasky report by his initials, KRL, which are Kenneth Ronan Larmer. The address is blacked out, but they said he's a court clerk. He's right in the Kasky report. When I read the report in the last year, it was saying that Ken met with Alan multiple times during the police investigation. Larmer was pulled in by the police and questioned as well. They even have a quotation in there that Larmer said to Alan Campbell, "Do you think you would have been set up in my own flat?" Which is a reference, now I understand, to the type of operations that were happening during that period of time. People may have been set up with these kids in the flats, or at least that was their point of view, or they were aware that people were being compromised. Mm-hmm. So it just was interesting that Ken Larmer had that sort of insight into maybe some of the stuff going on behind the scenes. In the court records that are documented in the Kasky report, as I read it, literally the case on Alan Campbell was tried in one court in week one, we'll call it, before a certain judge, and the defense case was held in a different court under a different judge, which of course that makes no sense. I'm just reading what I read in the Kasky report itself. Alan Campbell was let go with a fine, I think is what I saw in the report. Yet and the John, summary
was
line.
This before the Brian McDermott murder?
That I don't know.
He was murdered in 73.
It was before that. The case was heard in May of 1972.
So somebody working within the court system helped his friend, and as a result of that, the main suspect may have been free to kill Brian McDermott.
Yeah, and let me catch that thought for you, because I know for a fact personally that Ken Larmer brought court documents home and kept them in his closet.
You heard the name Mountbatten mentioned once, I believe?
Yeah, I mean, when Mountbatten was killed, I was again with Ken up in Belfast. And we were talking about it, and Ken was not a very emotional guy, and he cried and became very emotional. And he said, you know, he was a very good man, and he was so good to the boys in the homes in Belfast. You know, so again, I didn't know anything beyond that, but it takes on more significance as to why, you know, Ken always talked about the people he knew. And he talked about many names, you know, from the authorities in Northern Ireland. One of the other things that I still can't understand from Ken and his connection as a lowly court clerk is in the later part of his career after the sex abuse of me ended, I saw him in Dublin once, and he was down for a security conference meeting in Dublin Castle, cross-border security. He had Irish Gardaí security clearance and coverage when he came. He had a friend he visited in Slane in County Meath. And so when he crossed the border for a weekend, the Gardaí were watching over him. He had one or two Gardaí watching him to make sure he was safe. I took it as being normal Belfast security at the time. But it is strange that a court clerk would be in Dublin Castle for a security conference, and maybe that was normal. And at the same time, he brought me out for dinner and started talking to me about, he was bringing a £250,000 sterling bond over to London that was going to ultimately go to Cairo. I have no idea what that was about. He did some strange things that I'm still trying to take stock of.
Okay.
But I'm learning stuff about his friend Alan Campbell here in this conference call. I didn't understand the significance of Alan Campbell, or possibly him being responsible for Brian Dermot. I just knew him as a guy who was a friend of
one
Ken
thing we
Lama.
haven't addressed, John, you might be able to help us with, is what stage did the grooming of boys, to your knowledge, start?
8 or 10 years of age in general, and in talking with Richard and other people, that's when they're in a position of authority, they start as young as they can. And 8 to 10 is pretty normal, because the kids totally trust you and they don't know any better. And it can become a very civilized thing. In my case, I was abused for 3 years from the age of 13 to 16, and I was very naive. And actually referring to the fact that a lot of these kids were taken over the border from the north to the Republic. You got to remember in 1968, 1971 or 72, the Republic was very naive. They didn't think about even sex, never mind homosexual sex, never mind underage sex. So you were safe to be seen bringing a young boy to a hotel or something like that and just say he was my nephew or whatever, even if you were questioned. Whereas in London, they might have questioned that more, even back then. But the Republic didn't even, as Gay Byrne or somebody once said, that we hadn't invented sex yet.